Russia is amassing a massive amount of troops on NATO borders, particularly their borders with the Baltic states and with Finland. It looks like they are preparing imminently for their next invasion of Europe, attacking other European countries in addition to Ukraine, and completing their war of conquest. Or at least that's what I have been reading in headlines over the past year or so. Headlines which it turns out are almost always wrong. Not because they are reporting on incorrect facts, but because they are exaggerating those facts, and based on their exaggerations of the facts, are, in my view, completely misinterpreting what is actually going on here, and potentially very harmfully so. In this video, what I want to talk about is why Russia has been placing more troops and more military bases around NATO borders, which I don't believe is actually to prepare for an imminent invasion of NATO countries, although they may try that at some point in the future if they think they can get away with it. But actually, in the short term, I think Russia's strategy is far more sinister. And I think Russia's strategy actually goes back to those headlines that I mentioned at the very beginning, which are very scary, which instill a lot of fear in people, particularly within Europe, which therefore cause people within Europe to take certain actions and to not take certain actions, which might actually be playing directly into Russia's hands. Russia's current actions against Europe, of course, aren't merely limited to troop placements on their borders. Russia is currently engaged with what could rightfully be described as warfare against Europe, and those attacks come in many forms. They come in the form of sabotage attacks or cyber attacks, from setting fire to malls in Poland to cutting undersea cables in the Baltic. And I could list hundreds of other examples. Russia is waging a propaganda campaign and a disinformation campaign, and it's very clear that Russia is trying to do something in Europe. But when it comes to what Russia is trying to do in Europe, there are two major camps which by far make up the majority of opinions, both of which go to the extreme in one side or the other. There is one camp that says Russia is imminently preparing to attack Europe, and therefore Europe must immediately prepare to defend its own borders against Russian aggression. And then there is another camp that says Russia could never attack Europe because they are so bogged down by their war against Ukraine that they simply don't have the forces to open up another front, and therefore people in Europe shouldn't worry at all. And what I want to pose to you in this video is that the actual answer is somewhere in the middle. And the world really needs to have clarity on that so that they can make the right strategic decisions. And when I talk about the world here, I'm not actually talking about politicians or military leaders. I'm talking about the general public. Because it's become increasingly clear that Russia's main target in the West, in Europe, and in the United States is the general public, because they understand that their opponents are democracies. And therefore, to move things in the direction they want to go for the long term, their best bet is to influence the thinking of the general public, and therefore to influence who gets voted into office, and therefore to influence the decisions that are being made in the future. So when it comes to what we all think about Russia's next move, it's vitally important that the general public think carefully about the actual actions that Russia is taking. Russia is counting on exactly the opposite. So with that in mind, let's go back to the actual headlines I mentioned at the start of this video. Russia is amassing troops on NATO's borders. War is coming imminently. And what I want to focus on is the headlines themselves and the divergence between the headlines themselves and the actual reality of what has happened on the ground. Because I believe that divergence might actually reveal what Russia is trying to do here, and it's quite sinister, and it's really something that we should not be falling for at this point, 3 years into Russia's war against Ukraine. You'll often, for example, see headlines, particularly when it comes to Finland, saying that Russia is redeploying a massive amount of troops around the Finnish borders. And this has created certain actions with people actually taking specific steps to make military investments to defend the Finnish borders from what is perceived as a soon-coming invasion. But when we look at the actual facts behind the headlines, what we see is reality is far different than the picture that is created in imaginations. What we see is that Russia has actually deployed only 2,000 new troops near the Finnish border. They have plans to potentially grow that number up to 15,000 And they have talks of growing that number into the hundreds of thousands. And it's something similar you'll see when it comes to the Baltic states, but actually to an even lesser degree, where soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, they started talks about how they were going to create a new army corps around the Baltic states and around Finland that could one day grow into the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And what we see is what has actually happened is Russia has placed 2,000 soldiers near their borders, but the world has responded as if Russia has already placed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Now, I'll head off a potential argument early on in this video where people might misunderstand what I'm saying. And I want to say very clearly that what I'm going to say in this video is not that Finland and the Baltic states should just not defend their borders and just let Russia come in whenever they want. Obviously, we know that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and it makes complete sense that countries that are bordering Russia would be terrified, maybe even paranoid about Russia doing that. But within that, we also need to manage those fears and take some sense of practicality and reality when we see a divergence between the fears and what has actually happened on the ground. Because when we see a difference between the headlines and the reality, and we understand the opponent that the world is currently facing, which is Russia, our alarm bells should immediately go off. It has now been over 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and by now the world should have a very clear sense of how Russia works. And in particular, what the world should realize is that Russia is rather incompetent militarily. They are incompetent militarily because of endemic lies and corruption that permeate their society and permeate their entire military structure, as well as so many other things. But what a lot of people forget is that these same lies and corruption that permeate the society and make their military almost non-functional in actuality also make them incredibly good at something else, and that's what we've seen over the past 3 years, where Russia is incredibly good at spreading lies, misinformation, and propaganda. So good, in fact, that they have managed to largely keep the United States, their largest and arguably most important opponent, out of the war, largely up to this point. Russia, of course, has used several tactics to do that. They have done that primarily by instilling either fear, mistrust, or hatred, making the United States either terrified of Russian retaliation against them, getting the United States to hate Ukraine, or getting the United States to just basically say, Ukraine is not our problem. We know that these are their tactics, and we know that they have worked really well in the United States. And so we should be really alert to when these same tactics are potentially being used against Europe, and it is going under our noses, and we are not noticing what's going on. When it comes to a Russian invasion of Europe, it is very important that people acknowledge a couple of basic realities. First, it's very clear that Russia would invade Europe if they could. Second, it's very clear Russia cannot invade Europe right now because they are fully involved in a war against Ukraine. And as long as they are fully involved in a war against Ukraine, they simply cannot attack other European nations because that would bring down such wrath on them that they would almost immediately lose. That is very clearly apparent to anybody who pays attention to what's happening. And so when you realize that Russia's main fear is the wrath of Europe coming down against them, you have to ask them what tactics are they using today to prevent that wrath from coming against them today. And I think one of the main tactics Russia is using is making Europe overly fearful of a Russian invasion on a timeline that is far more accelerated than Russia could actually accomplish in reality, to prevent Europe from adequately supplying Ukraine to fight against Russia in the war that is actually waging today, trying to hedge their bets against tomorrow and failing to address the problem that actually sits in front of them immediately in front of their noses. There are, of course, two primary ways that Russia can nullify Ukrainian military equipment. They can destroy that equipment once it reaches the battlefield, or they can prevent that equipment from reaching the Ukrainian front lines in the first place. And the primary way that Russia can prevent equipment from getting to the Ukrainian front lines in the first place is by convincing other countries, whether it be the United States or European countries, that they need to hedge their bets and they need to hold back more reserves than necessary for a war that might come tomorrow. And I want to say I fully understand the psychology that forces both the United States and Europe to hedge their bets. So I want to provide a strategic breakdown of why it is actually a better way to hedge their bets to provide Ukraine with more equipment today than to hold back for what might happen tomorrow. And first, I just want you to realize the absolute effectiveness from an asymmetric warfare perspective and a cost perspective of what Russia has accomplished, whether they intended to or not, by creating these media headlines. By conducting sabotage operations within European countries and then moving a very small amount of troops to the borders of those same countries, troops that number literally in the single-digit thousands, alongside shells of new military bases that are not actually occupied by troops, but that theoretically maybe someday could be occupied, Russia has caused a lot of these countries to invest astronomical sums in their own defense, preparing for the army that they think might show up there tomorrow, instead of sending equipment to fight the army that has already shown up in Ukraine today. And simply from an asymmetric warfare perspective, Russia absolutely gets massive returns on investments when this happens. Again, whether it's right or wrong, this is for these countries to say. I'm just pointing out the actuality of what has happened. Because when Russia can put down 2,000 troops and there is now investments to counter 200,000 troops, Russia is definitely winning when it comes to that kind of math. I would argue, though, that the math of Europe should change. With every loss that Russia takes in Ukraine, it becomes more and more impossible for Russia to actually attack European countries. And even if Russia can still attack European countries, every soldier that is spent in Ukraine, every piece of equipment that is spent in Ukraine is a piece of equipment that can no longer be used to assault Europe. And so when you are holding back equipment for the assault that might come tomorrow, what you are actually doing is potentially making the assault that comes tomorrow worse than it would be if you used that same equipment on the battlefields in Ukraine today, put it in the hands of highly skilled operators who are holding Russia back very effectively and potentially giving them a chance to overwhelmingly defeat Russia. Now, of course, the calculus here has to be a matter of checks and balances. It can't be extreme one way or the other. You cannot take everything within a NATO country and give it all to Ukraine and leave nothing within the NATO country. But what you can do is you can potentially provide more to Ukraine as a proportion than you're keeping back for yourself, or at least grow the portion that is being given to Ukraine as an investment in your own defense if you're a European country. And a big factor that also needs to come into play here is the United States. Because the United States is not in Europe, because we do not have to defend our borders against Russia, this totally frees up our own resources to invest heavily in Ukraine so that European countries can invest a higher proportion in their own defense. The more that the United States gives to Ukraine, the more Europe can invest in their own defense. And the United States can very easily do this because the United States realistically is not facing any serious threats right now. People will say we're facing threats from China when they might potentially invade Taiwan. But even if China invades Taiwan, a lot of the categories of equipment that would be needed to defend Taiwan are completely different than the categories of equipment that would be needed to defend Ukraine. And so really from a strategic perspective, we need to consider whether or not Russia has kind of pulled the wool over our eyes and been able to get asymmetric benefits for itself by creating headlines that cause people within European countries and within the United States to be afraid. What I've seen a whole lot of over the past 3 years from various different governments and various different people is failing to fight the demon in front of us today because we are afraid of the goblin that might come tomorrow. And not only might the goblin never actually come tomorrow, although we do need to be prepared to some extent if it does, but the actuality of that coming tomorrow actually becomes less likely if we fight the foe in front of us today. But a lot of people respond rather than thinking through the calculus and the strategy of what's going on the battlefield. Instead of doing all that, they respond with fear. And that's why I started this video by saying Russia's main target is not the politicians, not the military leaders, but rather the general public, who the politicians and the military leaders respond to. Russia knows that military leaders and career politicians who really think shrewdly about this stuff, Russia knows that they know the calculus that I mentioned in this video. And the main reason that they don't act on that calculus is because there are overwhelmingly loud voices within their countries kind of pushing them in the opposite direction. Russia knows it's far easier to manipulate populations within Europe and within the United States than it is to manipulate the leaders directly, because we don't have a lot of context and we are prone to our emotions. So when we see a headline that says Russia is amassing troops on Finland's border, we respond to that headline rather than to the actual fact that there's 2,000 more troops on Finland's border and Finland could easily crush that force. It's not time to panic yet. Russia, what they are not counting on is for general populations to think carefully and strategically and to be in control of their emotions. So what I would say as my message from this video to everybody, whatever country you're in, is the same message that the British population told to themselves throughout World War II. Keep calm and carry on. Look at the facts for what they are, not for what the headlines say they are. Because it is very easy to manipulate a headline, it is very difficult to manipulate an underlying fact. Digest those facts. Ask yourself what is the best way to respond when you are thinking about not just that particular issue, but the broader strategy of everything that is happening in the world today. Nothing is disconnected. The message of this video is not for European nations not to defend themselves. I don't want people to get that idea at all. European nations should defend themselves to the level that they have to. They should also increasingly look, though, at offense as defense. Offense in the sense of sending weapons to Ukraine where the fight is today to prevent the fight from coming to them tomorrow. Otherwise, they might end up with large stockpiles of weapons that they actually have to use. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciated this video, please give a like and a subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps out the channel. If you do want to support my work more, of course, I don't expect that from anybody, but for those who want to, there are several links in the description of my videos where you can find a way to do so. I really appreciate all my supporters. You guys help keep the channel going. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one.